Sometimes the smallest accident is actually the moment your entire life begins to change. I never believed that until the afternoon I met Ryan Mitchell inside the oldest bookstore in downtown Columbus. Rain tapped gently against the tall front windows while soft jazz drifted through the quiet aisles lined with worn wooden shelves. I had stopped there after meeting with a client, hoping to escape the weather for a few minutes before driving back to the office. The store always felt untouched by time. Dust floated through warm sunlight. The scent of old paper filled the air, and every shelf seemed to hide another forgotten story waiting for someone willing to slow down long enough to find it. That was where I first noticed him. Ryan stood near the history section, wearing a faded green sweater beneath a navy jacket, carefully comparing two secondhand books with a thoughtful smile that made him seem completely at home among thousands of pages. There was something unusually calm about him. He looked like the kind of person who noticed little things everyone else rushed past. As I reached for a book from the top shelf, someone accidentally bumped into Ryan's shoulder while hurrying toward the checkout counter. Several books slipped from his hands, scattering across the wooden floor. Instinctively, I stepped forward to help gather them before anyone accidentally walked over them. "I am so sorry," the stranger called without stopping. Ryan simply smiled and replied, "It is okay," even though the person was already halfway to the door. As I bent down to collect another book, I noticed something else lying beneath one of the novels. It was an old cream-colored envelope tied with a thin blue ribbon. Unlike the books, it had not landed by accident. It looked carefully protected, almost treasured. Before I could reach for it, Ryan quickly picked it up with surprising urgency. His relaxed expression disappeared for just a moment, replaced by unmistakable concern. He carefully brushed away invisible dust before slipping the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket. When he realized I had noticed, he offered an awkward smile that seemed to apologize without using words. "Thank you for helping," he said quietly while stacking the books back into his arms. "No problem," I answered. "That envelope looks important." His fingers rested lightly over the pocket where he had hidden it. For the briefest second, I thought he might explain, but instead he looked toward the rain outside the window. "Some things are worth protecting," he replied with a gentle smile before changing the subject. "Do you come here often?" The conversation drifted naturally after that. We discovered we both preferred independent bookstores over large chains. Both enjoyed quiet coffee shops, and both believed rainy afternoons somehow made every book more interesting. Ryan laughed easily, yet every so often his hand returned to the hidden envelope almost without thinking, as though reassuring himself it was still there. The gesture happened often enough that I could not ignore it. Whatever rested inside those folded papers clearly meant far more than ordinary letters. Eventually, the rain stopped. We walked toward the front door together, exchanging names for the first time before stepping outside beneath clearing skies. As we headed in opposite directions, I glanced back once and saw Ryan pause on the sidewalk. He carefully touched the inside pocket of his jacket again before continuing down the street with the quiet determination of someone carrying not only an envelope, but an entire chapter of his life that he hoped nobody else would ever read. I had no idea then that the secret hidden inside those worn papers would soon change both of our lives in ways neither of us could possibly imagine. The following Saturday, I found myself returning to the same bookstore without admitting to myself that I hoped Ryan would be there. I told myself I was looking for a book on historic American architecture, but the truth quietly followed me through every aisle. There was something about our brief conversation that refused to leave my mind. Maybe it was the way he smiled so naturally, or maybe it was the strange mixture of warmth and sadness that appeared every time his hand touched the hidden envelope inside his jacket. Either way, I kept wondering about the story he had chosen not to tell. As luck would have it, Ryan stood exactly where I had first seen him, balancing a small stack of books while chatting with the elderly bookstore owner, who greeted nearly every customer by name. When Ryan noticed me, genuine surprise quickly turned into a friendly smile. "Looks like we have the same weekend plans," he said. "Either that or this place keeps pulling us back," I answered. He laughed softly, and somehow the conversation resumed as though we had known each other much longer than a few days. We wandered through different sections of the store, recommending favorite authors and laughing about books we had pretended to finish in school but never actually read. Ryan had a remarkable ability to make ordinary conversations feel meaningful. He listened carefully before speaking, remembered little details, and asked thoughtful questions instead of simply waiting for his turn to answer. Before long, the bookstore owner smiled knowingly and suggested that we continue our discussion at the neighborhood coffee shop across the street, because the store would soon be closing. We accepted without hesitation. The cafe overlooked a quiet brick-lined street where people walked their dogs, children rode bicycles, and autumn leaves drifted lazily across the sidewalk. We ordered coffee and found a table beside the window. The conversation flowed effortlessly from books to childhood memories, favorite cities, and the dreams we had quietly carried for years. I shared stories about designing homes that helped families build new beginnings instead of simply creating beautiful buildings. Ryan spoke about working at the bookstore because he loved watching people discover stories that changed the way they looked at the world. His enthusiasm felt genuine, yet every so often his expression softened into thoughtful silence before he gently redirected the conversation somewhere lighter. As afternoon turned into evening, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth in his eyes faded almost instantly. Without answering the call, he quietly silenced the phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Everything all right?" I asked. He nodded almost too quickly. "Just something I need to take care of later." Although he smiled again, it was different this time, carefully controlled rather than effortless. A few minutes later, he checked the time and apologized. "I promised I would be somewhere before 6. We walked outside together beneath the cool evening sky. At the corner where our paths separated, Ryan thanked me for the coffee and said he hoped we would meet again soon. I smiled and agreed. As I watched him disappear down the sidewalk, I noticed the familiar gesture once more. His hand rested lightly against the inside pocket of his jacket where the old envelope remained carefully hidden. This time, however, I also noticed something else. Instead of heading toward the nearby parking lot, Ryan turned onto a different street, leading away from the busy downtown district, walking with quiet determination toward a destination he clearly knew well. I stood there for another moment before heading home, unable to explain why a stranger's hidden burden had already begun to matter so much to me, yet somehow certain that our story had only just begun. Over the next several weeks, seeing Ryan slowly became part of my routine in ways neither of us had planned. Sometimes we met at the bookstore after work, sometimes at the small coffee shop across the street, and occasionally we simply walked through downtown Columbus while talking about everything from classic novels to neighborhood architecture. The conversations always felt effortless, yet there remained one part of Ryan's life that never seemed to surface. Whenever the discussion drifted toward family or personal plans, he would pause for the briefest moment before steering us toward another subject with his usual gentle smile. I respected the boundary, even though my curiosity quietly grew stronger with every passing day. One Thursday evening, I finished work earlier than expected after a client postponed meeting. Instead of driving straight home, I decided to stop by the bookstore to surprise Ryan with a newly released novel from one of his favorite authors. The owner smiled warmly when I walked through the front door. "You just missed him," she said. "He left about 10 minutes ago. Thursday evenings are always the same for him." I thanked her and stepped back outside, just in time to notice Ryan several yards ahead, walking quickly toward the parking garage. Without thinking too much about it, I followed at a comfortable distance, telling myself I simply wanted to return the book another day if he appeared busy. Instead of getting into a car, Ryan crossed 2 intersections and continued several more blocks until he reached Columbus General Hospital. He entered through the main doors with quiet familiarity, greeting the receptionist with a smile that suggested this was far from his first visit. I stopped across the street, uncertain whether I should continue or simply leave. Something about the scene made me realize that whatever Ryan had been carrying inside that old envelope was connected to this place. Respecting his privacy felt more important than satisfying my curiosity, so I quietly turned around and walked back toward my car. That night, however, I could not stop thinking about what I'd seen. The next afternoon, we met again for coffee, and Ryan looked exactly as he always did, cheerful, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in hearing about my latest design project. If I had not seen him at the hospital myself, I never would have guessed that anything weighed on his mind. Halfway through our conversation, his phone vibrated again. This time he answered immediately. His voice remained calm and reassuring as he listened. "I will be there in 20 minutes, he said softly. "Tell her I am on my way." After ending the call, he looked apologetically at me. "I am really sorry. Something came up." I smiled and nodded. "Do not worry about it. Go take care of whatever needs you." For a second, he looked as though he wanted to explain, but the words never came. "Thank you for understanding," he replied before leaving the cafe with hurried but steady steps. I watched through the window as he disappeared into the evening crowd, carrying the same quiet determination I had noticed on the day we first met. Later that weekend, while organizing old project files in my office, I caught myself wondering why someone as kind as Ryan always seemed to be racing against time. The mystery no longer felt like simple curiosity. It felt personal. I did not want to uncover his secret because I enjoyed solving puzzles. I wanted to understand the burden that kept appearing behind his smile, the invisible weight that never seemed to leave his shoulders no matter how brightly he laughed. Deep down, I sensed that whatever truth Ryan was protecting was not something shameful at all. It was something precious enough to guard with every ounce of strength he had. And for reasons I could not yet explain, I hoped that one day he would trust me enough to finally let me see it. The following week, everything changed without a single argument or dramatic goodbye. Ryan simply became harder to find. Our usual Saturday mornings at the bookstore quietly disappeared. The coffee shop where we often spent hours talking suddenly felt much larger with only one cup sitting on the table. I sent him a message asking whether everything was all right, and several hours later a short reply appeared. "I'm sorry. Things are busy right now. I will explain soon." It was polite, thoughtful, and completely unlike the conversations we normally shared. Days turned into another week. We still exchanged occasional messages, but they became shorter every time. Whenever I suggested meeting for coffee, Ryan apologized and said he had other responsibilities. I told myself not to take it personally. Everyone goes through difficult seasons. Still, I could not ignore the uncomfortable feeling that he was deliberately creating distance between us. One rainy afternoon, I stopped by the bookstore hoping to surprise him. The owner greeted me warmly before quietly shaking her head. "Ryan has been leaving early almost every day," she explained. "He looks exhausted, but whenever I ask whether he needs help, he just smiles and says everything will be fine." I thanked her and bought another novel Ryan had recommended weeks earlier. As I walked back toward my car, I wondered how someone who always encouraged everyone else could carry so much without asking for support himself. The following evening, my phone rang unexpectedly. It was Ryan. His voice sounded calm, but noticeably tired. "I know I have been disappearing," he said. "I just wanted to tell you I am sorry." I leaned back in my chair, relieved simply to hear his voice again. "You do not have to apologize," I replied. "I was just worried." A long silence followed before he answered. "Sometimes I think it is easier if people do not get too close to me." His words lingered in the quiet between us. "Why would you think that?" I asked gently. He let out a slow breath. "Because everyone has limits. Eventually they realize my life is more complicated than they expected." I wanted to tell him that friendship was never about choosing the easy version of someone. But before I could speak, he quietly changed the subject and wished me a good night. The call ended, leaving far more questions than answers. A few days later, I attended a neighborhood charity event where several local businesses had donated books, food, and supplies for families in need. While helping arrange boxes, I unexpectedly saw Ryan cross the room. He was speaking softly with an elderly volunteer before carrying several bags toward a family with 2 young children. His smile returned the moment he focused on helping someone else, yet when he noticed me standing nearby, surprise flashed across his face. For a brief second, I thought he might walk over, but instead he simply offered a small wave before continuing with his work. It was not rejection. It felt more like hesitation, as though he believed keeping me at a distance somehow protected me from whatever burden he refused to share. Driving home that evening, I realized I no longer cared about discovering a mystery for the sake of curiosity. I cared because Ryan mattered to me. Whatever he was hiding had begun shaping every decision he made, every invitation he declined, and every smile that disappeared the moment he believed nobody was watching. I did not know when the truth would finally come to light, but I had already made one quiet promise to myself. If Ryan ever found the courage to trust me with the story he had been carrying alone, I would listen without judgment, without pity, and without walking away. 2 days after the charity event, my office phone rang just before lunch. I almost ignored the unfamiliar number, assuming it was another sales call, but something convinced me to answer. A calm voice introduced herself as the manager of the bookstore. "Ryan asked me not to worry anyone," she said gently, "but I think he could use a friend today." My heart immediately sank. She explained that Ryan had left work early after receiving another call from the hospital. Without asking for more details, I thanked her and drove across town. When I arrived, I did not rush inside. Instead, I waited in the small garden beside the entrance, unsure whether Ryan would appreciate seeing me there. Nearly 20 minutes later, the hospital doors opened, and he slowly walked outside, carrying the same worn, cream-colored envelope I had first noticed weeks earlier. He looked exhausted, not because of lack of sleep alone, but because of the emotional weight he had been carrying for far too long. When he saw me, standing near the bench, surprise crossed his face, followed by a tired smile. "You really are difficult to hide from," he said softly. I smiled back. "Only when someone matters." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ryan sat beside me and looked down at the envelope resting in his hands. "I think I'm tired of pretending everything is fine," he admitted. Carefully, he untied the faded blue ribbon and opened the envelope for the first time since I had known him. Inside were photographs, medical documents, handwritten notes, and several folded birthday cards. He handed me one photograph showing a smiling teenage girl with bright eyes standing beside him at a county fair several years earlier. "This is my younger sister, Emma," he said quietly. "After our parents passed away in a car accident, she became my entire family." His voice remained steady, but every word carried years of quiet sacrifice. He explained that Emma had been living with a chronic medical condition requiring frequent treatment, regular hospital visits, and medications that insurance only partially covered. Ryan worked every extra shift he could find, saved every possible dollar, and quietly gave up countless opportunities because making sure Emma received the care she needed always came first. "The envelope reminds me why I keep going," he continued. "The birthday cards are from Emma. The notes are from our parents. I carry them whenever things become difficult because they remind me that I promised to take care of her." I listened without interrupting, understanding at last why he guarded those papers so carefully. The mystery I had imagined was never about shame. It was about love, responsibility, and promises made to the people who mattered most. Ryan looked away toward the hospital windows. "That is why I started avoiding you," he confessed. "I thought if you knew how complicated my life was, eventually you would decide it was too much." I shook my head immediately. "Ryan, the only thing that changed today is that I finally understand why you have been carrying so much alone." He looked at me uncertainly, as though expecting sympathy mixed with distance. Instead, I gently placed my hand over the closed envelope resting between us. "You never had to impress me," I said quietly, "and you never had to protect me from your reality. Real friendship is not about choosing someone only when life is easy. It is about staying when life becomes difficult." Ryan lowered his eyes as emotion filled the silence between us. For the first time since we met in the bookstore, the guarded expression that had hidden behind his smile slowly disappeared. He did not need to explain every detail anymore because the secret that had shaped every decision, every absence, and every quiet apology had finally been spoken aloud. And instead of pushing us apart, the truth became the very thing that brought us closer than either of us had ever expected. The conversation outside the hospital became the beginning of something neither of us had expected. Nothing changed overnight, yet everything felt different because the silence between us no longer carried unanswered questions. Ryan no longer needed to invent excuses whenever he rushed away, and I no longer wondered whether I had done something wrong. Instead, he began allowing me into the parts of his life he had protected for so long. A few days later, he invited me to meet Emma. I accepted immediately, although I quietly worried whether she would feel comfortable with someone she had never met. The moment I stepped into her hospital room, however, every concern disappeared. Emma greeted me with a bright smile that looked remarkably like Ryan's. Books covered the small table beside her bed. Colorful drawings decorated the walls, and a half-finished puzzle rested near the window where afternoon sunlight filled the room with warmth. "So you are Daniel," she said with a playful grin. "I have heard about you for weeks." Ryan looked embarrassed. "I might have mentioned you once or twice." Emma laughed softly. "Try at least 20 times. The light-hearted moment dissolved the awkwardness almost instantly. We spent the afternoon talking about books, favorite movies, and the small park Emma wanted to visit once her doctors allowed her to spend more time outdoors. Watching Ryan with his sister helped me understand him in an entirely new way. Every encouraging word, every patient smile, and every quiet act of care came naturally, not because he felt obligated, but because love had become the foundation of every choice he made. Over the following weeks, our routines slowly changed. Some evenings we met for coffee after work, while other afternoons I accompanied Ryan to the hospital before we stopped by the bookstore together on the way home. None of it felt like a sacrifice. It simply felt like sharing life, one ordinary day at a time. Ryan gradually stopped apologizing every time his phone rang unexpectedly or plans needed to change. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "Emma needs me for a little while," knowing I would understand. One evening, while we walked through the neighborhood park beneath trees glowing with early autumn colors, Ryan suddenly stopped beside a quiet pond. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course," I replied. He looked down at the water for a moment before speaking. "Why did you stay?" I smiled gently, because leaving never felt like the right choice. He shook his head with quiet disbelief. "Most people see complicated situations and slowly disappear." I looked at him carefully before answering. "Ryan, I never stayed because I felt sorry for you. I stayed because every conversation, every walk, every ordinary afternoon reminded me that you are one of the kindest people I have ever known. Your responsibilities did not change who you are. They simply revealed how strong your heart has always been." He remained silent for several seconds, blinking away the emotion gathering in his eyes. Finally, he laughed softly. "I spent so much time believing I had to carry everything alone that I forgot someone could choose to walk beside me." We continued along the path as evening settled quietly over the city. For the first time since we met in the bookstore, Ryan's steps seemed lighter, as though sharing the truth had finally allowed him to set down a burden he had carried for years. Looking at the peaceful reflection of the trees across the still water, I realized that trust is never built through dramatic promises. It grows through countless ordinary moments when someone keeps showing up, even after learning the truth, until one day you finally believe they're not going anywhere. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly peaceful. The hospital visits no longer carried the same heavy uncertainty because Emma's doctors were encouraged by her progress, and Ryan had finally stopped carrying every responsibility in complete silence. We still spent Saturday mornings wandering through the old bookstore, and the owner often smiled before either of us even reached the front counter. "My favorite customers are back," she would say, already setting aside newly arrived novels she thought we might enjoy. Those simple routines became something we both looked forward to after long work weeks filled with deadlines, appointments, and responsibilities. One crisp October afternoon, Ryan received a phone call while we were shelving donated books during another neighborhood charity event. The moment he hung up, I noticed an expression I had never seen before. It was not fear or exhaustion. It was cautious hope. "Emma's latest test results came back," he said quietly. "The treatment is working better than anyone expected." For a second, he simply stood there, almost unable to believe the words himself. Then he smiled, and this time the smile reached all the way to his eyes. We drove to the hospital immediately. Emma greeted us with the biggest grin I had ever seen, proudly holding up a small calendar covered with colorful stickers. "The doctor said I might be able to spend Thanksgiving at home," she announced excitedly. Ryan looked at her in disbelief before gently wrapping her in a careful hug. It was the first time I had ever seen him allow himself to celebrate without immediately worrying about what might go wrong next. On the drive home that evening, the city lights reflected across the windshield while soft music played quietly through the speakers. Ryan looked out the window for several minutes before speaking. "For years, I kept thinking happiness was something I had to postpone until every problem disappeared," he admitted. "Now I think maybe happiness happens while we are still solving those problems." I smiled because those words perfectly described the journey we had been living together. A few weeks later, another unexpected opportunity arrived. The bookstore owner invited Ryan to help manage a new community reading program for local children, combining his love for books with events that encouraged young readers throughout the neighborhood. Although Ryan was honored, he hesitated before accepting. "What if I cannot balance everything?" he asked one evening as we sat outside a small cafe, watching leaves drift across the sidewalk. "You already balance more than most people ever realize," I answered. "The difference now is that you do not have to do it by yourself." He looked at me thoughtfully before letting out a quiet laugh. "You always make difficult decisions sound simple." "No, not up ya. I just think you finally deserve to believe in yourself the way everyone else already does." The following weekend, Ryan accepted the position. Watching him organize the first reading event surrounded by children excitedly choosing their next favorite book reminded me of the young man I had met months earlier among the dusty shelves of the old bookstore. Back then, he had been carrying an envelope filled with memories and responsibilities that felt almost too heavy to bear alone. Now he still carried the same envelope, but it no longer represented only the weight of the past. It had become a reminder of how far he, Emma, and even I had traveled together. Standing across the room while Ryan laughed with the children, I realized that sometimes healing does not arrive through one extraordinary moment. Sometimes it grows quietly through ordinary days shared with the right people, until one morning you look around and discover that hope has slowly replaced fear without either of you even noticing when the change began. Thanksgiving arrived with unusually mild weather, and for the first time in years, Ryan and Emma celebrated the holiday at home instead of inside a hospital room. Their small apartment was filled with the comforting aroma of roasted turkey, fresh rolls, and homemade pumpkin pie that Emma insisted on helping prepare despite Ryan's repeated reminders to take breaks. I arrived carrying a loaf of bread for the neighborhood bakery, only to find Emma already directing everyone like the host of a cooking show. "Daniel, you're just in time," she announced with a smile. Ryan almost burned the green beans because he was reading while cooking. Ryan laughed and raised both hands in surrender. "I was only checking one page." We spent the afternoon sharing stories, laughing over old family photographs, and discovering that the happiest holidays rarely depended on expensive decorations or perfect meals. They depended on the people gathered around the table. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on the couch with a book resting on her lap, Ryan and I quietly stepped onto the apartment balcony overlooking the neighborhood. Small strings of lights decorated nearby buildings, and the cool autumn air carried the distant sounds of families celebrating together. Ryan rested his arms on the balcony railing and looked out across the quiet street. "For a long time, I believed every good thing in my life came with a deadline," he admitted softly. "I kept expecting happiness to disappear the moment I relaxed." I stood beside him and watched the lights reflecting across the windows of nearby buildings. "Maybe happiness was never something you had to chase," I replied. "Maybe it was simply waiting until you finally allowed yourself to notice it." Ryan smiled thoughtfully before reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. Once again, he removed the familiar cream-colored envelope tied with its faded blue ribbon. This time, however, he did not hold it with the same guarded expression I had seen the day we met. Instead, he untied the ribbon, carefully removed one of the folded notes, and handed it to me. It was written by his father several years before his passing. The final sentence read, "Take care of each other and never be afraid to let kind people into your life." Ryan folded the note again with gentle care. I carried these words everywhere because I thought they meant I had to solve every problem by myself, he said quietly. Now I realize my father probably meant the opposite. I nodded, understanding that the greatest change had not been in the envelope itself, but in the way Ryan now understood its meaning. During the following weeks, life continued moving forward with quiet confidence. Emma returned to school part-time. The bookstore reading program welcomed more children every Saturday, and my architectural firm approved a community library project that immediately made me think of Ryan. One snowy afternoon, I invited him to visit the construction site before work began. Standing together on an empty lot, I showed him the early design sketches featuring bright reading spaces, comfortable gathering areas, and large windows overlooking a small public garden. Ryan studied the drawings for several moments before smiling. "This place is going to help a lot of people create new memories," he said. I looked at the unfinished space where concrete would soon become walls and empty ground would become something meaningful. "That is always the goal," I answered. As we walked away through the gently falling snow, I realized that both of us had been quietly building something far greater than buildings or careers. We had been building trust, hope, and a future shaped not by the secrets we once carried alone, but by the courage to finally share them with someone willing to stay. 1 year later, the old bookstore still stood on the same quiet corner in downtown Columbus, its wooden floors creaking beneath every visitor just as they had on the rainy afternoon when Ryan and I first met. Some things had changed, however. The display window now featured a colorful sign welcoming families to the weekly community reading program. And every Saturday morning, children gathered inside with excited voices that filled every corner of the store. Ryan had become the heart of those events, recommending books with the same warmth that had first drawn me toward him, while Emma proudly volunteered beside him whenever her school schedule allowed. Watching them laugh together no longer reminded me of the difficult months behind us. Instead, it reminded me of how much hope could quietly grow when people refused to face life's challenges alone. My own architectural project had also reached an important milestone. The community library officially opened that spring, welcoming neighbors into bright reading rooms overlooking gardens filled with flowers and shaded benches. During the opening ceremony, I invited Ryan and Emma to be among the first visitors. As children explored every corner of the building, Ryan stopped beside the largest window overlooking the courtyard and smiled with quiet pride. "You did not just design a building," he said. "You created a place where people will make memories." I looked around at the families discovering books together and realized he was right. Buildings mattered, but the lives unfolding inside them mattered even more. Later that afternoon, we returned to the bookstore after the celebration. The elderly owner smiled as she watched us arranging books for the next reading event. "Do you remember the first day you met here?" she asked with a knowing expression. Ryan laughed softly. "I remember dropping half the books in the store." I smiled. I remember thinking the envelope was the biggest mystery I had ever seen. Ryan reached into the familiar inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed the cream-colored envelope one last time. The blue ribbon had become faded with age, but the papers inside remained carefully protected. He untied the ribbon, removed one empty sheet, and quietly placed it beside the older letters from his parents. Then he handed me a pen. "I think it is time this envelope carried something new," he said. Together we wrote a short note that simply read, "Kindness changes lives more than fear ever can, and sharing a burden makes hope strong enough to grow." Ryan folded the page carefully and placed it inside before tying the ribbon again. "Now it carries our story too," he said with a peaceful smile. As evening sunlight streamed through the bookstore windows, Emma looked up from the children's section and called us over to help choose books for the following weekend. Ryan and I exchanged a quiet smile before walking toward her together. Looking back, I often think about how easily our paths could have missed each other that rainy afternoon. A dropped stack of books, a forgotten conversation, or a different decision might have changed everything. Instead, One carefully guarded secret became the beginning of a friendship built on trust, compassion, and unwavering support that slowly grew into a future neither of us had ever imagined. Sometimes people believe the most important moments in life arrive with grand announcements or dramatic changes, but our story taught me something very different. The moments that shape us forever often begin with simple kindness, quiet patience, and the courage to let someone see the truth hidden behind a smile. Every time I walk past the bookstore now, I no longer think about the mystery inside an old envelope. I think about the extraordinary life that unfolded because one person finally trusted another enough to share it. And I know that some stories do not change the world because they are extraordinary. They change the world because they remind ordinary people that hope always begins when someone chooses to stay.